I never should have gone back to the cabin, but I did. And now, even though I'm far from those woods, I still feel like I never really left. It started with a letter. My grandfather owned a small hunting cabin in Black Hollow, a stretch of dense forest in northern Montana. It had been in the family for decades, used mostly for weekend trips, but no one had set foot in it for nearly 15 years. Not since my grandfather disappeared. I was only 10 when it happened. One day, he went up there alone like he always did, but he never came back. A search party found his truck parked outside, his rifle still inside the cabin. No signs of a struggle, no tracks leading away, just gone. Over time, my family stopped talking about it. The cabin was left to rot. It sat empty, untouched, as the trees slowly swallowed it. Then, a month ago, I got a letter from the county. Apparently, since no one had paid property taxes in years, the land was about to be reclaimed. I could either sell it, sign it over, or go up there and handle the paperwork myself. I don't know why I chose the last option. Maybe I wanted closure. Maybe I just wanted to see it with my own eyes. So, I packed up my truck, took a week off work, and headed into the woods. The road leading up to Black Hollow was worse than I remembered. The deeper I went, the narrower the path became. The trees pressed in on both sides, thick with branches that clawed at my truck. I had to slow to a crawl to avoid deep potholes filled with stagnant water. The whole way, I felt like I was being watched. It was just the woods, I told myself, just the quiet. But my hands wouldn't stop gripping the wheel too tightly. By the time I pulled into the clearing, the sun was already starting to set. And there it was, the cabin. The roof sagged slightly, the front porch was warped, and the wooden steps were split down the middle. The windows were coated in grime, and the door, which had once been bright red, was now dull and faded. For a long moment, I just sat there. Then I killed the engine. The silence swallowed me immediately. No birds, no wind, no rustling leaves. Just thick, empty quiet. I stepped out, my boots crunching against the damp ground. The air smelled like rotting wood and something else. Something metallic, faint but present. I ignored it. I unlocked the cabin and stepped inside. The inside was almost exactly how I remembered it. The old wood-burning stove sat against the wall, the shelves still lined with rusted cans of food. A single cot was pushed into the corner, the thin mattress covered in dust. A table sat in the center of the room, one chair missing a leg. But something felt off. The air was too still, too thick. I shook it off, set my bag down, and started looking around. Nothing seemed disturbed, just years of neglect, dust, and time. The only thing that stood out was a small wooden chest in the corner. I didn't remember that being there. I walked over, knelt down, and lifted the lid. Inside was a pile of old papers, yellowed with age. I picked one up. My grandfather's handwriting. I hear them at night. My skin prickled. I flipped through the pages. They moved through the trees, watching, waiting. I am not alone out here. I swallowed hard. My throat felt tight. These were his notes, his last thoughts before he disappeared. I shut the chest and stood up too fast. The room swayed. I needed air. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The night had settled in quickly. The sky was pitch black, the trees just dark shapes against the void. And then, a sound, a low, steady creaking, like wood bending under pressure. My eyes flicked to the tree line. Nothing. I told myself it was the wind, even though there was no wind. That night, I barely slept. I locked the door, kept the flashlight next to me, and lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling. Every small noise made my skin crawl. The soft creak of the old beams, the distant snap of a branch outside. Somewhere in the early morning hours, I must have dozed off. Then I woke up. Something had changed. The air felt heavy, charged. The kind of feeling you get when someone is standing too close to you. I reached for the flashlight, turned it on, and aimed it at the door. The lock was still in place. Then I saw it. The window. The grime-covered glass had been wiped clean, just enough for someone to see inside. Perfect, smudged circle. My chest clenched. I stayed still, gripping the flashlight so hard my fingers ached. But there was nothing there. No movement, no sound, just the woods, watching. The next morning, I made a decision. I was leaving. I didn't care about the paperwork. I didn't care about the cabin. I just wanted to be gone. I packed my bag, threw open the door, and stepped onto the porch. That's when I saw the footprints. Not boot prints, bare feet, leading from the woods, circling the cabin, and then disappearing back into the trees. I scanned the tree line, my pulse hammering. Still nothing, but I could feel it. Something was out there, watching, waiting. I sprinted to my truck, threw my bag inside, and turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, then died. A cold sweat broke across my skin. I tried again. Nothing. Then, from the woods, a sound. Slow, deliberate movement. Twigs snapping. Coming closer. I locked the doors, gripped the wheel, and I waited. The noise stopped. Silence. Then, a slow, deliberate knock. Not on the truck. On the cabin door. The breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. Didn't blink. Then, another knock. And another. Steady. Patient. I stared at the cabin, my heart hammering. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The woods swallowed everything again. I don't remember much of what happened next. I must have stayed in that truck for hours, waiting for the sun to rise. When it finally did, I tried the engine one last time. It roared to life. I slammed it into reverse, turned onto the dirt road, and never looked back. I drove straight home, never told anyone what happened. Never went back. The county reclaimed the land a few weeks later. The cabin is gone now, but sometimes late at night I wake up to a sound, a slow, deliberate knock, and I wonder if something followed me home. It was supposed to be a quiet getaway. That's what I told myself as I packed up my truck and drove 4 hours deep into the mountains. Just me, a few days off work, and a cabin I had rented for the long weekend. I needed the break. Life back home had become too noisy, too stressful. The idea of being out there, alone in the quiet wilderness, seemed like the perfect way to clear my head. The drive was long, but the deeper I got into the forest, the more at ease I felt. The roads were mostly dirt, winding through thick pines and tall grass. No signs of civilization for miles. Exactly what I wanted. I arrived at the cabin just before sunset. It was small but well-built. Dark wooden logs stacked neatly, a green metal roof, a porch with a single rocking chair. It looked old but sturdy, the kind of place that had seen harsh winters and heavy storms but still stood strong. I stepped out of my truck, stretched my legs, and took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. No sounds except for the distant chirping of birds and the occasional rustling of leaves. No cars, no people, no ringing phones. Just silence. I grabbed my bag, locked my truck, and stepped up onto the porch. The door was already unlocked, which was odd, but I assumed the owner had left it open for me. The inside was simple: wooden floors, a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a single bedroom. A large window faced the forest behind the cabin, and for a moment, I just stood there, taking it all in. I lit a fire in the fireplace as the sun dipped below the trees. The warmth felt good. I pulled out a book, sat in the old rocking chair, and let the quiet settle around me. Then something changed. It was subtle at first. The feeling you get when someone's watching you. I kept looking up from my book, glancing out the window, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just darkness and the faint outlines of the woods. I shook it off, blamed it on my brain adjusting to the quiet. Around midnight, I decided to turn in. I double-checked that the door was locked, shut the windows, and climbed into bed. The cabin creaked softly in the wind. A normal sound. Then I heard something else. A thud came from outside, near the front porch. My heart started pounding. I held my breath and listened. Silence. Then another thud. Closer this time. I sat up slowly, my mind racing. A bear? A deer? Maybe the wind knocked something over? I grabbed the flashlight I had packed, got out of bed, and crept toward the window. I shined the light outside. Nothing. I held it there for a moment, scanning the porch, the trees, the dirt path leading up to the cabin. Still nothing. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw them. Footprints, fresh, leading from the edge of the woods to my porch. But no sign of anyone there. I froze. My brain tried to find a logical explanation, but there wasn't one. I knew what I was seeing. Someone had walked up to my cabin. Someone had been out there. I locked the front door again, checked the windows twice, and sat awake in bed, listening. Hours passed. Nothing happened. No more sounds. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside, hoping maybe I had imagined it all. But the footprints were still there, clear as day, and they weren't mine. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. They were human, barefoot, leading from the woods to my porch and then stopping. Not turning around, not walking away, just stopping, like whoever had made them had just disappeared. A chill ran down my spine. I looked around, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. The forest was still quiet. Too quiet. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe some hiker had wandered too close, gotten scared off when they saw my truck. Maybe they had turned around and the wind had just covered the tracks leading away. It was a weak excuse, but I forced myself to believe it. The day went on normally enough. I went for a hike, gathered some firewood, and tried to shake off the unease from the night before. By the time the sun started setting, I felt more relaxed. I told myself I had just let my imagination get the best of me. Then, just as I was about to start a fire for the night, I saw something that made my stomach drop. New footprints, same size, same barefoot shape, leading from the woods to the porch. And this time they were fresh. My hands went cold. I had been outside all day. I would have noticed if someone had been near the cabin. Whoever had made those tracks had done it while I was inside. My heart started racing. I grabbed my flashlight again and swung the beam toward the woods. My eyes darted between the trees, looking for movement, for any sign of whoever was out there. Nothing. I forced myself to think rationally. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe. Then I saw something else. On the porch, right in front of the door, a single handprint, smudged onto the wooden boards. Small. Too small for a grown man. I backed away slowly, my mind screaming at me to run. But run where? My truck was locked, my keys were inside, and even if I did leave, I was miles from the nearest town. I stood there for what felt like hours, my body frozen, my brain scrambling for an answer. Then, slowly, I walked inside and locked the door. I moved a chair in front of it. It wouldn't do much, but it made me feel safer. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the floor with my flashlight, staring at the door, listening for any sound. At some point, just before dawn, I heard it again. A thud, but this time it wasn't outside. It was inside. My breath caught in my throat. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, my hands shaking. The thud came again, softer this time. Closer, then silence. The kind of silence that swallows everything. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened. Minutes passed, then hours. The sun started to rise, casting light through the window. And just like that, the feeling was gone. I didn't waste time. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and bolted for the truck. I didn't even look back as I peeled out of there, kicking up dirt behind me. I drove straight home. Didn't stop. Didn't tell anyone. A week later, I checked the rental listing again. The cabin was gone. No record of it. No owner to contact. Like it had never existed. I don't know what happened that night. I don't want to know. But I do know one thing. I will never go back. I needed time away from everything. Life had been too much lately. Work, people, the constant noise. I wanted to be alone for a while. Somewhere quiet. Somewhere far away. So, I rented a cabin deep in the woods, hours from the nearest town. Just a simple wooden cabin, surrounded by trees, with no neighbors, no cell service, and nothing but the sound of the wind and the animals. It sounded perfect. The drive took most of the day. The roads got worse the farther I went. pavement turned to gravel, then to dirt, then to something that barely looked like a road at all. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows between the trees. The cabin was small but solid, made of thick logs with a slanted metal roof. There was a porch out front, a stack of firewood, and a single rocking chair. The door was already unlocked when I arrived, which made me uneasy, but I figured maybe the owner had left it open for me. Inside, it was simple: one bedroom, a small kitchen, a fireplace, and a big window looking out at the trees. I set my bag down, checked the place out, and lit a fire as the cold started to creep in. The quiet was almost too much. No traffic, no voices, just the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the wind moving through the trees. I told myself this was what I wanted: peace. That first night, I sat in the rocking chair, listening to the fire crackle. Every now and then, I thought I heard something outside, soft movements, like footsteps in the leaves. But every time I looked out the window, I saw nothing, just darkness and trees. I slept lightly, waking up every few hours to check the window. Something didn't feel right. I blamed it on being alone, on my mind playing tricks on me. By morning, I felt stupid for being so jumpy. I spent the next day hiking, exploring the woods. There was no real path, just miles of trees stretching in every direction. I didn't go too far. I knew how easy it was to get lost out here. As the sun started to set, I made my way back to the cabin. That's when I noticed something strange. Footprints, not mine. They were fresh, leading from the trees to my cabin and stopping near the porch. Barefoot, I felt a chill crawl up my back. Someone had been here while I was gone. But why? Who? And where had they gone? I scanned the woods, but there was nothing. Just trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. I went inside, locked the door, and grabbed the old hunting knife I had packed, just in case. I wasn't scared, I told myself, just cautious. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing noises outside, soft movements, twigs snapping. I wanted to believe it was just animals, but something felt off. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. A single, heavy thud against the wall of the cabin. My heart stopped. I gripped the knife and listened. Nothing. I forced myself to stay still, to breathe quietly. Minutes passed, then hours. Finally, as the first light of morning crept through the window, the feeling of being watched faded. When I stepped outside, my stomach turned. More footprints, more than before. They led around the cabin, stopping near the windows, the door. Someone had been watching me. I was done. I packed my things, threw them into my truck, and started the engine. The tires spun in the dirt for a second before catching. I didn't look back. I just drove. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just some lost hiker, maybe a prank. I tried to forget about it, but weeks later I saw something online. The cabin. It wasn't for rent anymore. The listing was gone. The owner never responded to my messages. It was like it had never existed. And the worst part? A news article. A body had been found deep in those woods. A hiker. No shoes, no supplies, just a look of terror frozen on his face. I don't know what happened out there. I don't want to know, but I will never go back. I needed to get away. Life had become a relentless cycle of work, obligations, and the constant noise of the city. I told myself I just needed a weekend alone. Somewhere quiet, somewhere far from people, traffic, and screens. A few days with nothing but nature and silence. That's why I rented the cabin. It was deep in the woods, hours from the nearest town. The rental listing described it as rustic but cozy, the kind of place where you could truly disconnect. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just miles of trees in every direction. The pictures made it look peaceful. A small wooden structure with a wraparound porch, a fire pit out front, and a dense forest behind it. It was exactly what I needed. I left early on a Friday morning, wanting to make the trip before dark. The first couple of hours were easy, just highways and open roads. But the farther I went, the more isolated things became. Gas stations turned into single pump stops in the middle of nowhere. Towns became nothing more than a few scattered buildings. By the time I turned onto the dirt road leading to the cabin, I hadn't seen another car in almost an hour. The road was rough, filled with potholes and uneven patches where the rain had washed parts of it away. My truck rattled as I drove, the trees closing in on both sides. Felt different out here, quieter. Not just the kind of quiet you get in the countryside, but something deeper, heavier. No distant hum of traffic, no voices. Just the sound of my tires crunching over gravel and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. When I finally saw the cabin, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It looked just like the pictures, small, sturdy, made of thick logs. There was a porch with a single rocking chair, a stack of firewood piled against the side, and a narrow dirt path disappearing into the trees behind it. I pulled up, killed the engine, and stepped out. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I stretched my legs, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. It was peaceful, empty. I grabbed my bag and stepped up onto the porch. The key had been left under a loose board near the door, just like the owner had told me in his email. The cabin was unlocked, but that didn't surprise me. Out here, who would bother locking their doors? Inside, it was just as simple as I expected. A small living room with a stone fireplace, a single couch, and a wooden table. The kitchen was tiny, just an old gas stove and a fridge that hummed a little too loudly. The bedroom had a twin-sized bed, a dresser, and a single window facing the woods. I checked the place over, making sure everything was in order. The water ran, the lights worked, and there were no weird smells, just the scent of old wood and dust. Everything seemed fine. I spent the rest of the evening settling in, making a quick dinner on the stove and starting a fire in the fireplace. As the sun dipped below the trees, the world outside the window turned dark. Pitch black, no streetlights, no distant glow of a city, just endless darkness pressing against the glass. It was unsettling. I sat in the rocking chair, listening to the fire crackle, trying to ignore the feeling creeping up the back of my neck. The feeling that I was being watched. I shook it off. First night alone in an unfamiliar place, it made sense to be a little on edge. I went to bed early, locking the front door out of habit, even though I knew it probably wasn't necessary. I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, just a soft, rhythmic thump outside the cabin. A steady, deliberate noise, like footsteps moving through the leaves. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. I stared at the ceiling, heart pounding. It was probably an animal, a deer maybe, nothing to worry about. But as I rolled over, trying to shake the unease, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The window was open, just a crack. I was sure I had closed it before bed. Hadn't I? I got up slowly, moving toward the window, listening for any sign of movement outside. The darkness beyond the glass was absolute. My reflection the only thing staring back at me. I shut the window, locked it, and crawled back into bed. For a long time, I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence. Morning came slow. I stepped outside with a cup of coffee, stretching, trying to shake the lingering unease from the night before. That's when I saw them. Footprints, fresh, leading from the tree line to the porch. Barefoot, my stomach turned. I scanned the forest, my heart hammering. There was no sign of anyone. I crouched down, studying the prints. They were small, too small for an adult man. A child? That didn't make sense. There were no houses out here, no signs of a campsite nearby. I stepped back, feeling suddenly exposed. I told myself it was just some lost hiker, someone wandering too close. That had to be it. Still, I spent the rest of the day on edge, checking the window more often than I'd like to admit. I locked everything, the windows, the door. I even moved a chair in front of it just in case. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was overreacting. But that night, the noise came back. A slow, steady thud. Not footsteps this time. Something knocking. On the porch. I sat up in bed, my throat dry, every muscle in my body tense. The knocking stopped. Then, tap, 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 against the bedroom window. I didn't move. didn't breathe. The sound came again. Tap, 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 slow, rhythmic, like someone was standing right outside. I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, my hand shaking. I clicked it on and aimed it at the window. Nothing, just the reflection of my own face staring back at me. I sat there, gripping the flashlight, waiting. Minutes passed, then hours. Eventually, exhaustion won. I don't remember falling asleep. I left at first light, didn't pack, didn't eat, just grabbed my keys and got in the truck. I didn't look back. When I finally got cell service again, I searched for the cabin online. The listing was gone. The owner never responded to my messages. But I found something else. A news article. Years ago, a boy had gone missing in those woods, vanished without a trace. They never found him. But sometimes, hikers reported seeing footprints, barefoot, small, leading from the trees to the cabins, always stopping at the windows, always watching. I needed a break. Life had become suffocating. Long hours at work, the endless hum of the city, the constant push and pull of people everywhere. I hadn't taken a real vacation in years, and it was starting to wear on me. I felt like I was running on fumes, always one bad day away from burning out completely. That's why I booked the cabin. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small place way out in the woods, miles from the nearest town. No internet, no neighbors, no distractions. Just a simple wooden structure with a porch, a fireplace, and enough supplies to last a few days. It sounded perfect. The drive out took longer than expected. At first, the roads were easy, smooth asphalt cutting through small towns and stretches of farmland. But the farther I went, the more isolated things became. Gas stations turned into rundown shacks with a single pump. Towns became nothing more than a few scattered houses. The road narrowed, the pavement giving way to rough gravel. By the time I reached the final stretch, a single dirt path winding through dense forest, I hadn't seen another car in nearly an hour. The trees pressed in from both sides, towering and thick. The sunlight barely broke through the canopy, casting everything in a dull, greenish gloom. My tires crunched over the dirt and fallen leaves as I followed the path, the cabin's location pinned on my phone's GPS. Then the signal cut out. No bars, no connection. I wasn't surprised. The rental listing had warned about the lack of cell service. That was part of the appeal. I wanted to unplug, to be unreachable. Still, it gave me an odd feeling, a deep sense of being completely alone. I pushed the thought away and kept driving. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a small wave of relief. It looked exactly like the pictures, small, sturdy, and weathered by time. A simple wooden structure with a slanted roof, a stone chimney, and a wraparound porch with a single rocking chair. A stack of firewood sat neatly beside the door, and an old metal lantern hung from a hook near the entrance. I pulled up, killed the engine, and stepped out. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. The only sounds were the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional creak of branches swaying in the wind. No traffic, no voices, just silence. I grabbed my bag and headed inside. The interior was simple, a small living room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table, and a worn-out couch. The kitchen was tiny, with an old gas stove and a fridge that hummed loudly. There was one bedroom, a bathroom, and a single window that faced the trees. Everything seemed fine. A little dusty, maybe, but that was expected. I set my bag down and checked my supplies. I had brought plenty of food, bottled water, and a flashlight with extra batteries. The cabin had a backup generator for electricity, but I wasn't planning on using it much. I wanted to enjoy the quiet, or at least that's what I told myself. As the sun dipped below the trees, I lit a fire in the fireplace. The warmth filled the cabin, the flames casting flickering shadows along the walls. I sat in the rocking chair, staring into the fire, letting the silence settle around me. Then I heard it, faint sound outside, a soft, steady crunch of leaves. I froze, listening. It was probably an animal, a deer maybe, nothing to be worried about. But the sound didn't fade, continued slow, deliberate, like footsteps. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, my heart pounding. I moved to the window and lifted the curtain just an inch, peering out. Nothing, just the trees, standing tall and unmoving in the darkness. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The isolation, the quiet, it was making me paranoid. I locked the front door, double-checked the windows, and forced myself to go to bed. Morning came, but the unease didn't leave. I stepped outside with a cup of coffee, stretching my legs. The forest was still, the early morning fog clinging to the trees. Then I saw them, footprints, leading from the edge of the trees to my porch. Barefoot, my stomach tightened. I looked around, scanning the woods, but saw nothing. No movement, no signs of anyone. The prints were small, too small for a grown man. A child? Out here? That didn't make sense. I crouched down, tracing the path of the prints. They led from the tree line to the porch, but there were no prints leading back. Whoever had come out of the woods had never left. I felt my pulse quicken. I forced myself to stay calm. It was probably just some lost hiker, someone wandering too close to the cabin. That was the logical explanation. But deep down, something felt wrong. Very wrong. I locked everything. The door, the windows. I even pushed a chair up against the front door, just in case. I told myself I was overreacting. Then, around midnight, I heard it again. The footsteps. Soft, slow, moving outside the cabin. I sat up in bed, holding my breath. Then came the knock. Not loud, not frantic. Just a slow, rhythmic tap, tap, tap on the front door. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, after what felt like forever, the tapping stopped. Silence. I stayed awake all night, listening. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I finally got up the courage to check outside. The footprints were back. But this time, they weren't just near the porch. They were all around the cabin, circling it. Some led up to the windows. One set stopped directly in front of the bedroom window. I felt a cold wave of nausea roll through me. Whoever had been out there, they had been watching me, standing just outside my window. I grabbed my keys, threw my bag over my shoulder, and got into my truck. I didn't look back as I drove away. Didn't breathe until I hit pavement again. When I finally got back to town, I pulled over at the first gas station I saw. I needed a moment, needed to clear my head. That's when I checked my phone. I had service again. I opened the rental listing thinking I might leave a review, maybe warn the next person. But the listing was gone, like the cabin had never existed. Leaving everything behind. I was burnt out. Work had been draining me for years. Every day felt the same. Early mornings, long hours, coming home to an empty apartment, eating whatever was fastest, and falling asleep just to do it all over again. I barely saw friends anymore. I didn't date. It felt like my entire life had been swallowed by routine. I needed to get away from it all. The cabin seemed like the perfect escape. It was listed on a rental site, described as off-grid, peaceful, and perfect for solitude. It was deep in a valley, miles from the nearest town, with no cell service or internet. The pictures showed a small, sturdy wooden cabin, nestled between towering trees, with a stream running nearby. It looked perfect, a place where I could unplug, think, maybe even figure out what the hell I was doing with my life. I booked it for a week. The first few hours of the drive were easy. Highways, then country roads, then smaller winding roads through thick forest. The farther I went, the less I saw of the world. No cars, no people, just trees stretching in every direction. Eventually, the paved road ended. My GPS told me to take a dirt path, barely wide enough for my truck. The road twisted down into the valley, uneven and full of deep ruts. My tires kicked up dust and loose rocks as I descended, the trees pressing in closer. Then my phone lost signal. I expected that. The listing had warned about it. Still, it gave me an unsettling feeling. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the valley. The place looked just like the pictures, small but solid, built from thick logs with a steeply pitched roof. There was a porch with a single rocking chair, a rusted metal lantern hanging beside the door, and a neatly stacked pile of firewood. The only sign of modern convenience was the old generator tucked against the side. No other cabins, no other houses, just miles of wilderness in every direction. I climbed out of the truck, stretched my legs, and took a deep breath. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. It was completely silent. No traffic, no distant hum of civilization, just stillness. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The cabin's interior was simple but comfortable. A single room with a fireplace, a small kitchen area with an old gas stove, and a heavy wooden table. A narrow hallway led to a tiny bedroom and bathroom. Everything smelled of aged wood and dust. I unpacked my food and supplies, started a fire, and made a simple dinner. By the time I was done eating, the sun had set. Darkness swallowed the valley fast, thick and absolute. I turned on the generator for a little while, enough to give myself light to read by. Then I shut it off, locked the doors, and crawled into bed. I slept deeply. The next morning, I woke early and stepped outside with a cup of coffee. The air was cold, mist curling over the valley floor. The trees stood motionless, the world completely still. Then I noticed something strange. The firewood pile had been disturbed. When I'd arrived, the logs had been stacked neatly. Now, several were scattered on the ground like someone or something had rummaged through them. A raccoon? A bear? I scanned the trees, looking for movement. Nothing. I shook it off and spent the day exploring. There was a narrow trail leading deeper into the valley, winding alongside a stream. I followed it for a few miles, listening to the water trickling over rocks, the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I didn't see any signs of other people. No old campsites, no tire tracks, nothing to suggest anyone had been here recently. By late afternoon, I turned back. The cabin looked the same as I'd left it. The firewood was still scattered. I picked up the logs, res-tacked them, and headed inside. That night, I locked up again, turned off the generator, and crawled into bed. I woke up to a sound, a soft thud outside. I held my breath, listening. Another thud, then the sound of something scraping against wood. I sat up slowly, my pulse hammering in my chest. The cabin was pitch black. I fumbled for my flashlight, clicked it on, and pointed it toward the window. Nothing. The sound stopped. I forced myself to breathe, telling myself it was just an animal. A deer brushing against the cabin, maybe, but I didn't sleep much after that. Morning came, and I stepped outside, my skin crawling with unease. Then I saw them, footprints, leading from the tree-line to my porch. Barefoot. The prints were small, too small for an adult man. They started from the edge of the woods, walked straight to my cabin, and never walked away. I felt a cold sweat break across my skin. I scanned the trees, every nerve in my body screaming at me to leave. But I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe the prints were old, and I just hadn't noticed them yesterday. I needed to clear my head. I spent the afternoon fishing by the stream, trying to focus on something normal. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night, I locked up tighter than before. I moved a chair against the door. I shut the bedroom curtains. I gripped my flashlight like a weapon. I barely slept. The sound came back. Not a thud this time. Not scraping. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Circling the cabin. I lay in bed, frozen, listening. Then a soft tap, tap, tap against the bedroom window. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. I didn't dare shine my flashlight. I didn't want to see what was out there. The tapping continued for what felt like hours. Then silence. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, the sun was rising. I got out of bed, every muscle stiff with fear. My hands shook as I unlocked the door and stepped outside. The footprints were back, dozens of them, circling the cabin, stopping at the windows, and the firewood scattered again. But this time, the logs had been arranged into a shape, a symbol. I didn't recognize it, but something in my gut told me it wasn't random. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and threw everything into the truck. I didn't clean up. I didn't look back. I just drove. When I finally reached a paved road, my phone got service again. I pulled over at the first gas station, my hands still shaking. I checked the rental listing. It was gone, like the cabin had never existed. I don't scare easily. I never have. I've spent nights alone in places that would make most people uneasy. Isolated cabins, empty houses, deep woods miles from civilization. Silence and darkness never bothered me. But after what happened last fall, I don't go into the woods alone anymore. It started as a simple trip. I had been working long hours for months, barely seeing daylight, and I needed to get away. I found a listing for a remote cabin deep in the northern woods, far from any town or highway. It was cheap, had running water, a wood stove, and came with plenty of firewood. That's all I needed. The drive was long, 6 hours on the highway, then another 2 on winding dirt roads. The last stretch was rough. The path leading to the cabin was barely a road, just 2 tire tracks cutting through thick forest. My truck bounced over deep ruts, branches scraped the sides, and I had to slow down more than once to avoid potholes that looked like they could swallow a tire. By the time I arrived, the sun was low in the sky. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by towering trees. There was no other sign of life. No cars, no houses, not even a fence. Just the woods pressing in from every side. I killed the engine and stepped out. The air was crisp, the smell of damp earth and pine filling my lungs. I stretched, listening to the quiet. No traffic, no voices, just the wind moving through the trees. I grabbed my bags and headed inside. The cabin was simple. 1 main room with a wood stove, a small kitchen, and a door leading to a tiny bedroom. The walls were old wood. The floor creaked under my boots, and the place smelled like smoke and dust. It was perfect. That first night, I made a fire, cooked a quick meal, and sat by the window with a book. Outside, the darkness was absolute. No streetlights, no glow from distant towns. Just the black silhouettes of trees against the starry sky. Then I saw the dog. It was standing at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the dim light. A big, dark shape, motionless. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel it watching me. I figured it was a stray, maybe a hunting dog that had wandered too far from home. I stood up to get a better look, and when I turned back, it was gone. I didn't think much of it. I locked the door, stoked the fire, and went to bed. The next morning, I woke to pale light filtering through the trees. I made coffee and stepped onto the porch. The ground was covered in fallen leaves, damp from the night's dew. The air was cold, the woods silent. Then I saw the prints. Deep, heavy paw prints circling the cabin. They weren't there the night before. I stared at them for a long time. They weren't like normal dog tracks. They were too big, too deep. Whatever left them was heavy. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe it was just a big stray. Maybe it had smelled food and wandered around during the night. But if that was the case, why didn't I hear it? That day, I hiked the surrounding woods. The trees were thick, the undergrowth tangled. I followed the dirt path for a few miles before cutting through the trees, just exploring. It was beautiful out there, silent, untouched. But the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By late afternoon, I made my way back to the cabin. The sun was starting to set, the sky turning soft shades of orange and pink. Then I saw it again. The dog, standing at the tree line, closer this time. It was big, bigger than I'd thought the first night. Its fur was thick and dark, matted in places. It didn't move. It just stood there watching. I took a step toward it. It didn't flinch, didn't back away. I stopped. Something about it felt wrong. I turned and walked inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside made my skin crawl. The wind in the trees, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves. I kept imagining the dog, standing just outside the door, listening. In the morning, I found more tracks. They led from the tree line all the way to the cabin, right up to the porch. My stomach twisted. That meant it had been right outside while I slept. I checked the door, the windows, everything was locked. But still, it had been there. I spent the day gathering firewood, trying to shake the feeling of unease. But the woods felt different now. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was waiting. By the time the sun started to dip, I had made up my mind. I was leaving in the morning. That night, the scratching started. First, it was faint, just a soft, dragging sound against the wood. Then it got louder. Long, slow scratches along the door. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and shined it toward the door. The scratching stopped. I waited, breath held. Then I heard it move. Pause on the porch. Heavy, slow. I gripped the flashlight tighter. The doorknob rattled. My chest tightened. The metal handle shook like something was testing it. I grabbed my gun. My hands were shaking. I aimed at the door, waiting for something to happen. The rattling stopped. Silence. Then a deep, low growl, right outside the door. I stayed like that for hours, gun in hand, heart hammering. Eventually, the noises stopped. I don't remember falling asleep, but when I opened my eyes, the first rays of sunlight were spilling through the window. The door was open, just an inch. Something had been inside. I didn't waste time. I threw my things into my bag, grabbed my keys, and bolted for the truck. The second I stepped outside, I saw the prints. Deep, heavy tracks leading from the porch to the woods. It had watched me. I jumped into the truck, slammed the door, and started the engine. Gravel sprayed as I hit the gas, speeding down the narrow dirt path. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. Even then, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I never went back for my things. I never even called the owner to explain why I left early. I just left. For weeks, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those tracks. I heard the scratching at the door. Then, one night, weeks later, I woke up to a sound outside my apartment window. A low, deep growl. I didn't look. I didn't move. I just lay there, frozen. In the morning, I found the tracks. They weren't dog tracks. They were too big. I moved the next day. I've always liked being alone. Some people need noise and company, but I prefer silence. That's why I rented the cabin. It was small, deep in the woods, miles from anyone. No distractions, no responsibilities. Just me, my thoughts, and the sound of the wind in the trees. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was dipping behind the trees. The cabin was old but sturdy, with thick wooden walls and a steep metal roof. There was a small porch, a woodpile stacked neatly beside it, and a narrow dirt path leading from the single-lane road where I had parked. I had everything I needed: food, water, firewood, a few books. I planned to stay for a couple of weeks, maybe more if I liked it. The first night was peaceful. I built a fire in the wood stove, made myself a simple dinner, and read by lantern light. No cell service out here, not that I wanted any. The stillness was perfect. The next morning, I woke early. The sun barely touched the treetops, and the air was cold. I brewed coffee on the propane stove and took my mug outside. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction, thick with pine and underbrush. The quiet was different in the morning, not oppressive, just heavy, like the forest was still waking up. That's when I saw the dog. It stood at the tree line, maybe 30 yards away. Big, black, its fur thick and matted. It just stood there, watching. Its ears were up, its eyes locked on me. I don't know how long it had been there. I called out to it, not expecting a response. It didn't move, just stared. I wasn't sure what to do. Could be a stray, or maybe it belonged to someone nearby, though I hadn't seen another soul on the drive-in. I thought about leaving food out, but something about it made me hesitate. I watched it for a few more minutes, then went inside. An hour later, I looked out the window. The dog was gone. The next few days, I kept seeing it. Never up close, never moving. Just standing in the trees, watching. Once, I saw it at dawn, its dark shape barely visible between the trunks. Another time, late at night, when I stepped out to get more firewood. I shined my flashlight toward the woods, and there it was, eyes reflecting the light. It didn't blink, didn't flinch. I started feeling uneasy. I'd been around dogs my whole life, and they don't act like that. A stray might approach, curious or hungry. A wild dog would be skittish or aggressive. But this one, it just watched. By the fourth day, I stopped going outside after dark. One morning, I woke up early and decided to check around the cabin. The ground was soft from rain the night before, and I noticed tracks in the mud. Deep paw prints circling the cabin. They weren't there the previous day. That meant the dog had been close. Really close. Maybe while I was sleeping. I followed the tracks a few feet into the woods before they disappeared into the underbrush. I felt watched. I turned back fast, locking the door behind me. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Every creak in the wood, every gust of wind outside made me tense up. I was waiting to hear something. Scratching at the door, paws on the porch. Nothing came, but I knew it was out there. The next morning, I smelled something rotten. I found the deer not far from the cabin. It was fresh, hadn't been there the day before. His body was torn open, ribs exposed. But something was off. The kill looked wrong. Predators like wolves or bears eat. They tear off chunks of meat. This deer had been ripped apart, but nothing had been eaten. His body was just left there, torn to shreds. And the tracks? They were the same deep paw prints I'd seen outside my cabin. The dog had done this. I stood there, my stomach twisting. Something wasn't right. No dog, no normal dog would kill like that. I went back inside and locked the door. That night, the noises started. First, it was just scratching, soft at the base of the door. Then I heard it move, paws on the porch. Slow, deliberate. I didn't breathe, didn't move. Then the handle rattled. It was testing the door. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. My gun was in the nightstand. I grabbed it and pointed it at the door, even though I knew a bullet wouldn't do much against a dog that size. The rattling stopped. Silence. Then a deep, low growl. Right outside. I stayed like that for hours, gun in hand, waiting. Eventually, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the window. I checked outside. Nothing. No footprints, no signs that anything had been there. But I knew it had. I wasn't safe here. I packed my things in record time. I didn't care about leaving early. I just wanted out. I loaded my truck, locked the cabin behind me, and hit the road. The forest was dense, the dirt road winding. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see the dog behind me. Then, miles down the road, I did. It was running. Fast. Keeping up with my truck, even as I picked up speed. Its body was low, muscles rippling under matted fur. Its mouth hung open, teeth bared. It wasn't barking. It wasn't making a sound. I slammed the gas. The truck roared down the road, bouncing over potholes, branches scraping against the sides. Then it was gone. Just gone. I didn't see it stop, didn't see it turn. 1 second it was there, the next the woods were empty. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back. I made it back to town before I let myself breathe. I checked into a motel, locked the door, left the lights on. The next morning, I went outside just to convince myself it was over. Then I saw them, paw prints, in the dirt right outside my motel door. It had followed me,